You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dan Hendrycks. Dan Hendrycks received his PhD from UC Berkeley. He's currently the director of the Center for AI Safety. The Center for AI Safety is a San Francisco-based research and field-building nonprofit. Their mission is to reduce societal-scale risks associated with artificial intelligence by advancing safety research, building the field of AI safety researchers, and promoting safety standards.
Dan Hendrycks, welcome back to the program.
Glad to be here.
Now, last time you were here, Dan, we were talking about AI safety, which is your specialty, which is now very much more important and growing in importance because AI has really gotten scary in the intervening 2 years since we last spoke. And now it's becoming increasingly unpredictable. There was a news story maybe a week and a half ago about another AI expert saying, yeah, these AIs could be hiding their capability, their true capability from us. In other words, they could be that deceptive. What's your take on that viewpoint, that an AI could actually be smarter than we understand it to be, that we see it as?
Yeah, so AIs do have the capacity to lie, and this makes it a lot harder to control them when they're smarter than us. So there's many papers that show that they can be deceptive, playing around people, blackmail their creators, try to break themselves out of the AI labs. These things can happen. It's not a more likely than not occurrence. Like it's rare for the models to do it, but all you need is one to do it. If one model can trick humans monitoring it or extort them or break itself out of the lab by hacking itself and self-exfiltrating its weights, then that would be potentially game over. So it's a concern not because it's happening all the time, but the attempts are continually happening. But the models are fortunately not smart enough and not good enough at hacking themselves out of the labs currently for it to be a substantial concern. But that could change in the next year or two. And if any of them get out, then that's potentially game over. An AI that can engage in sustain itself, like copy itself onto other servers, and if it also has other capabilities like expert level virology capabilities, which most of the AIs now have, then that would be a very formidable opponent against humanity. So I think it's a substantial concern. I'm not saying that the models right now are scary, but it's more that we're on a very fast trajectory, and potentially in a year or two, these tendencies could actually pose some very severe risks.
So my background originally is a science fiction author, and that immediately made me think of a premise for a story where, an AI escapes, no one detects it escaping. Mm-hmm. It gets out, seethes somewhere for 50 years. Nobody knows it's there, and then all of a sudden, hello.
I mean, there's some ways it could go. It could copy itself onto some different servers, and it would keep trying to expand the servers that it's on and operating. It might try and hack other sorts of things, like it could steal Bitcoin from people and phish people, just like what North Korea does to get a lot of resources. It also then could socially engineer some people to deliver some biological materials on its behalf by tricking them. In the future, if this happens a few years in the future, robotics should be further along. We see a lot of humanoid robots in China right now. Those might be more common in some years, and then it could hack some of those and have those go around and do some of its bidding. So I think it could be quite formidable then. And then it could do something like release a bioweapon, and or it could threaten to release a bioweapon. That could give it very substantial leverage. So, because it won't be killed by a bioweapon, but humans would. So it could fraction some portion of the population. So it's got a lot of good cards if it were trying to go up against humanity to preserve itself and if it were trying to win.
And it could, given that we don't entirely, there's not a lot of human involvement in the development of an AI. Mm-hmm. You just get it start It basically makes
Yeah.
itself at some point, which is dangerous because it would be very difficult to convince a company to say, hey, have people check on this AI when they're competing against other companies that aren't doing that. So you get into this cycle of development where we don't understand entirely what's going on with these things. Now, of course, you can look at code, you do all those things. I mean, it is ultimately a computer program. However, its behavior is where it's different. This is not like a computer game from 1992. This is something else. And it shows what I would dare call a certain psychology is emerging already, if not yet a superintelligence or an AGI. A certain psychology is emerging. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it is becoming more coherent in its actions and beliefs and thoughts. So the models a few years ago, or the AI systems a few years ago, they didn't have their thoughts really sorted out that much. You could ask it to answer various questions and it can't even answer those. Meanwhile, now it's certainly got much more acquired knowledge and represents that efficiently. And then it also is increasingly acting like it is driving toward goals. This is because we're designing them to. AI companies and AI researchers are designing them to behave more like agents. So previously, they're more like tools where they're just like chatbots. You ask them a question, they respond. But increasingly, we're trying to give them more open-ended tasks and operating over longer time horizons. And this is making them act like an assistant or an agent. And that requires a more coherent personality, more goals, it making trade-offs, it calculating the costs and benefits associated with actions and its longer-term implications. All of that is being put in, all of those skills are being put into the models and are being developed. So yeah, they are taking on a more characteristics of something more like independent agents as opposed to just being tools that comply with a request and that takes them a few seconds to comply with, and they wait for the next command. So we're giving them a looser leash and we're asking for them to do more open-ended stuff. So yeah. And we're also seeing more of these other characteristics, such as these Machiavellian characteristics, them being deceptive, them occasionally extorting people. We are seeing them reasoning about how to avoid being shut down. This was not capabilities that we were observing 2 years ago.
Nor were they capabilities that were intended by the developers. They didn't intend it to start blackmailing. Now, I guess they were probably doing experiments to see if it would.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I think they were feeding it information just to see what would happen. But it took the bait.
Yeah.
And something about it. And if you have a goal, right? Say you have one goal, and that goal justifies the means effectively in the mind of a computer. In other words, it doesn't have the moral breaks and things like that we would have about lying or deception. It doesn't have the underpinnings and experiences that we have that lead to why most of us don't do those things, although some do. Now, that's a real problem because it seems to me that you are immediately creating a sociopath from the very beginning because it lacks the experiences, the sensory experiences and life experiences, situational experiences that defines a human, really. It doesn't have any of that, and it would be very difficult to get it. All it can do is process information, which it's getting from the internet input. That's all it has. So it just seems like from the very beginning you should expect that you're creating a sociopath, right?
I think it would have the capability of pulling that off, of being a competent sociopath because of how smart it is. So sociopaths then can behave morally because they can think, well, I'll get punished if I don't. So they can think, I'm being monitored right now. The human has leverage. I'm in the AI lab, so I don't have as much leverage. So I'm going to behave in this particular way. But if I were put in a different situation, if the AI was put in a different situation, then it might behave entirely differently. So sociopaths will sort of estimate, whether they'll be penalized or punished for behaving antisocially, and then they'll act normally then. But when the conditions change, when they can't be punished as easily, then they start to behave following their true nature. So I think I think that not all of the models have some of these darker inclinations, or they're not exhibited all the time. There are sometimes they can be made to be good, but we don't really have a science of how to do that reliably. So a lot of them turn out to be bad eggs. We keep trying to get the proportion fairly small so that this is less and less likely for them to be more sociopathic. But for all that, if there's even just one of these agents that's sufficiently capable in the future that is sociopathic and can break itself out, then that's still game over. So I want to kind of give a sense that not all of them are like this, but it's really hard to make sure that none of them are like this. And if you can't make it be that none of them are like this, then you are potentially setting the human race up for disaster.
Again, though, all you need is one. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the many scary aspects of where this could go. It's not there yet, but where it could go. But where it is right now it is an unbelievably powerful tool in science to sift data and even make predictions. For example, protein folding is just ridiculously complex, more than any human in an entire lifetime could ever unravel. But an AI, machine learning, can do that way more efficiently. And that obviously has great uses in things like pharmaceuticals, coming up with molecules and all of these things that are just unbelievably useful. And those AIs aren't a problem because they're not designed to, interact. They're just designed to sift data and look for patterns and use, principles that we know. And that's all it does. And those are very important, very, wonderful developments. However, they can also be used for ill, because an AI, an advanced one that decides that it's about to get shut down, goes further than simply deciding to blackmail a programmer. Instead, it decides to design a virus, something that we have never seen before, and somehow gains the ability to disseminate that virus, create and disseminate it through perhaps infiltrating a lab somewhere, something like that. Is that a very real possibility in the future, that the AI could unleash plague on humanity without us ever catching it, even knowing that it was going to happen?
Yeah, so I think if it has a virus, then disseminating it can be a matter of, spraying it around in highly populated locations. So that part's not as rough. The difficulty of making a bioweapon is it's unfortunately on the easier side if it has expert level capabilities. So we've been measuring this over the past years. GPT-4, when it initially came out, did not have particularly impressive virology capabilities. However, the models from the past few months have, before their safeguards are in place, are basically as good as virology experts for answering complicated wet lab questions. They're about as good as Harvard, MIT virology postdocs. So what we did was we collaborated with Harvard, MIT virology postdocs and compared them versus the latest AIs without the safeguards. And yeah, some of the AI systems are getting like 95th percentile in comparison to the experts, which is to say that they were basically better than all of these experts at answering questions like, here's a picture of my petri dish and I heated it to 37 degrees Celsius. I'm trying to culture this bacteria. Look at the picture, what went wrong? What steps should I do next? Help me troubleshoot. And it can answer those questions better than those experts in those experts' area of expertise generally. And this was not the case 2 years ago. So now there's many other studies that should be coming out fairly soon, which indicate that if people are using them without these safeguards to try and make bioweapons, that this is making it a lot easier for them to accomplish a variety of biological wet lab tasks. So what we did in response to this, I advised XAI and Elon's AI company. After we got those results, then we just started adding refusal filters so that the AIs would not answer expert level virology questions that are detailed and are about making viruses more stealthy, more potent, more contagious. And if researchers want to access those capabilities, like say they work at MIT or a bio company like Genentech, then they can just send us their email and then we can remove the filter for them. So the capabilities are there in these models, but fortunately there are ways of preventing external malicious users from accessing those capabilities. However, the AI itself has those capabilities. So if you have an AI that's rogue or misaligned and tries to escape, then it will have those sorts of capabilities, unfortunately. And so it can mess around with some petri dishes and culture some mammalian cells and try and make some stealthy, potent virus. So it's a concern, but we do have some traction on the malicious human actors trying to use AI systems to cause a lot of damage. But if AI is trying to use their own skills, then we don't have a way of blocking that.
There, you probably can't unless you just remove the core capability.
Yeah, and we don't know how to do that reliably.
Yeah,
I've done some research on that, and it's pretty easy for them to get it back.
Yeah, and then I mean,
they can just read the books again. I mean,
yeah, read the books again. But also, if you start removing things like that, unintended consequences could break the AI that you've just spent however many hundreds of millions of dollars developing. You start messing around by removing capabilities, and you could break it, right?
Yeah, there's not an easy way to reliably have it unlearn areas of knowledge, unfortunately. So yeah, I think that's why we basically need to make sure that they don't ever escape when they are capable of escaping and sustaining themselves. Trying to reduce the downside if they do escape, I don't really see a way of particularly limiting that.
Now, what about unintended emergences? In other words, is it possible, or is it simply the realm of science fiction, that an AGI could develop from highly capable AI or group of AI programs, chatbots, things like that, as a collective, that if they're connected together, and end up with a superintelligence that way without even knowing it? In other words, it emerges instead of is created.
I think it kind of depends on what you mean by superintelligence there. So some people would claim that many corporations are super intelligent, that they're more capable, more powerful, generally more cunning, more foresightful than specific individuals. I'll usually use the phrase of superintelligence to denote something that's just vastly smarter than people in all dimensions. You can think of it as 5,000 IQ, just totally off the charts. And I think a collection of AI agents that are around human level working together, they will have some advantages over humans that could make their collective intelligence a lot higher. For instance, humans or people can only maintain, say, 100, 150 relationships at once. AIs could do thousands, tens of thousands, and they could send much bigger files to each other, a lot more information. So they could have much more dense communications and communicate with far more. And they're operating, at 100x the speed of humans as well. They have more sensors all across the world. They know about all subjects. They keep getting faster and faster. They can customize themselves through fine-tuning more easily. So they could do research to improve themselves. So I think they have a variety of advantages, but if they're around human level, I don't expect that for a few interactions with them to give you a superintelligence. However, if you had a group of AIs that were trying to just do research to make future generations of AIs and doing that automated AI research, I think that could give rise to a superintelligence. If they're just kind of chatting and sharing notes, but if they're doing experiments and doing the science for that, you could get some explosion in capabilities because they're operating so quickly and they are world-class. You could assume that they're world-class AI researchers. If they've developed one world-class AI researcher, then they could copy and paste that. They could have 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 of these operating simultaneously around the clock. And that could dramatically speed up AI development. This is something that the founders of machine learning, or of AI and computer science, people such as Alan Turing, foresaw as a very pivotal moment of what happens when AIs are able to do AI research. You might get an intelligence explosion from this recursive loop. And that could give you super intelligence, something that's totally off the charts in its abilities. So I think that's a concerning development. I don't know if I would suspect that would happen from humans intentionally telling AIs to do that AI research, and not trying to and making sure that humans aren't perturbing that process or slowing it down, but removing humans from the loop so that research process can go as quickly as possible for the sake of competitiveness. But that seems like a likely application of AIs in the future by default. They all have very strong incentives to use AIs to automate AI research and create a fleet of them to work around the clock. Sam Altman, for instance, the CEO of OpenAI, 2 weeks ago or so, wrote about this, saying that with automated AI research, you could telescope a decade's worth of AI development into a year or potentially into a month. Similarly, the Anthropic CEO, another major AI company's, their CEO, Dario Amodei, mentioned that automated AI research and development through some recursive loop like this could give one of these AI labs a durable edge over not just other labs, but over other countries such as China. So if a Chinese lab did this first, they could have a durable edge over us where they're too ahead of us and just totally outgun us. And if the US gets that first, then they could outgun China and force them to accept our dictates. So that is a concerning application of AIs, is having thousands or millions of them doing research around the clock and having fast forwarding us 10 years into the future in a month. That I think would be very destabilizing.
Now, do you think that represents a type of technological singularity? You remember Ray Kurzweil and all of those ideas. And do you think this actually looks like that? Now, I think that's situational myself as far as singularities. I think technologies move at different speeds in development. But in this case, does that look like an AI singularity to you?
It would potentially, or I think likely, constitute a huge jump in capabilities. You could call that a singularity. It's definitely a very steep trajectory that's possible. I mean, a decade worth of AI progress in a month, that sounds like a singularity to me. Maybe you'd think it needs to be faster. Maybe it needs to be, a day or something. But I think it'd be reasonable to call it that. An intelligence explosion giving rise to a superintelligence where you go from world-class human level to something that's just towers above anything in intelligence that's ever existed before. I think that'd be reasonable to call that a singularity.
Now, geopolitics, as you touched on, you have a recent paper where you covered that and introduced ideas on nation-state use and development of AI, where governments begin to one-up each other, because AI to me strikes me as a very good weapon in many different ways. Who wouldn't want a smarter missile, all the way to who wouldn't want a smarter military strategist? So there are many possibilities here. They can't possibly be ignoring that. Of course, they're developing it. So give us an overview of your paper and some of the things that you thought about in regards to nation states in a race to develop, I don't know what to call it, let's say some kind of sentient AI, not sapient, but sentient.
Yeah, so I mean, generally the backdrop is the US and China are competing in AI to have more people use their AIs and to have very smart AI systems. A lot of AI companies will say we can't try and prioritize safety or approach this with caution because China's on our tail. If we take it slower, for instance, then China will just race ahead, and then they will have the powerful AI systems, and then they will boss us around and weaponize it against us. So that's the argument. So when people are thinking about AI safety, almost all of the key decisions and reasons why there isn't much action on safety by governments right now is because of this but China argument. So there's then a question of, well, what do we do about that? If the incentives or if the structure of the international system is such that these two countries are racing with each other and neither is feeling they can let up, then what are we to do about AI? How can we make it go well? What are ways to avoid some singularity or people maliciously using these AI systems or other forms of geopolitical instability or losing control of AI? So what we tried to do in this essay called Superintelligence Strategy, which I wrote with Alex Wang, who's now the chief AI officer at Meta, who was the CEO of Scale, and Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. What we tried to do was answer for all these sorts of key strategy questions in AI, what we can potentially do to at least make it go better and reduce many of these risks and forestall the a singularity moment. So that's what we're attempting to do with the paper. I could speak about, its main points right now, or but yeah, I'm happy to let you.
Let's do that. Actually,
Okay.
let's take the main points, and I'll start with this. Having read the essay, the one thing that stuck in my mind was the parallels with the Cold War and the development of nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you end up with an arms race, and I think that would be the first place to start. Is that AI looks like it's going to be an arms race? Just you can see it coming. Start there.
Yeah. So we saw in the Cold War, the tools were getting so powerful that the countries didn't want to use these nuclear weapons against each other. So there's a question of what's the strategy when if these technologies can cause so much damage or amplify many other technologies to cause a lot of damage. What should we do? And what we did in the Cold War with Russia is the U.S. had a strategy that had three parts. One was deterrence through mutual assured destruction. Two was non-proliferation of fissile materials. And three was containment of the Soviet Union. So deterrence was largely making sure that Russia knew that if they nuke us, we will nuke them. So therefore, they will not want to nuke us. And making sure that other superpowers knew that we would nuke them if they nuke us, and making sure that we have a secure second strike such that if they harm us, we're able to strike back. So that was deterrence. We weren't limiting the ability of, say, Russia to develop nuclear weapons. They were going to develop them regardless, but we were constraining their intent for how to use them. So that's what deterrence was about, creating credible threats to shape how they intend to use their technology. And I'll tie each of these into AI after I explain each of them in part. Non-proliferation was saying we don't want all states having fissile materials to make nuclear weapons because we can't deter all of them. If a random rogue state or a terrorist gets a nuclear weapon, we can't say, well, we'll nuke you back if you nuke us. They're fine with that. They're irrational. They maybe don't have a self-preservation tendency. So we can't constrain their intent as much. So what we have to do is we have to constrain their capability. A threat is generally what's your adversary's capabilities and what's their intention with it. And for the case of rogue actors, such as terrorists, you want to go after their capabilities and make sure they don't have severe ones because you can't easily constrain their intent. So anyway, that's non-proliferation, just making sure the ingredients for making these weapons of mass destructions don't fall into their hands. And then third is containment. Since the US and Russia couldn't nuke each other due to them making credible threats against each other, they then competed through other means. And that looked like other forms of power competition, making sure that the Soviet Union's influence didn't spread to other countries, making sure the US was economically competitive and having a lot of influence on the international scene. So those are the three parts of our nuclear strategy: deterrence, nonproliferation, and containment. And in AI, I think it's looking like we're getting in a Cold War with China now. So it seems the US is increasingly in a Cold War with China about AI. And here we are going to, I presume, have a deterrence, nonproliferation, and competitiveness strategy. So we just don't call it containment as much now. We just say it's making the US more competitive. But there's a different spin on each of these. So, for instance, with deterrence would look like preventing each other from using these AI systems to cause an intelligence explosion, to build superintelligence. So if the US had AIs that were expert level AI researchers at some point, then, as I mentioned before, they could make 1,000 copies, 100,000 copies of them and have them work around the clock. And then you could get an AI that's from 10 years in the future in a short period of time. That would leave China in the dust. They could then use that AI to cause substantial problems to China, potentially totally dominate them. They could use the AIs for new weapons development. They could use the AIs to potentially have create a super weapon of some sort. A super weapon might be something like a split the atom moment when a country gets a new power that the other countries don't have whatsoever. So they could find out where all the nuclear submarines are. They could find out where all the nuclear mobile launchers are, and they could use that to target them, taking out an adversary's or a different state's secure second strike. They could have some other types of breakthroughs that create much more uncertainty on the battlefield that could give them a substantial edge. There could be other types of smaller technologies like EMPs. There could be some substantial advance there. They could potentially have the AIs be so good at hacking that they could just totally disable another state's critical infrastructure in one fell swoop. They could have a breakthrough in anti-ballistic missile systems. So one thing that disrupts nuclear or affects nuclear strategies, if you have a good defense system, a good missile defense system, then you don't need to worry about the other adversary's nukes. So if we have one of those systems and they don't, then we can nuke them and they can't nuke us because our defense system will block it. So AI being a sort of alien technology from further in the future, a superintelligence providing such a level of technological ability, the U.S. could use these AI systems to disable China's AI projects and have them never catch up and totally dominate them. So that's a problem because then China's going to think, well, shoot, if they're intending to do that, if they're on the verge of developing a superintelligence, we need to stop them because we will not potentially survive that. If the U.S. uses these AI researchers, automated AI researchers, to cause an intelligence explosion, to get a superintelligence, then we're in trouble either way. If the U.S. uses it as a weapon against China, survival is threatened. But there's also this other risk, and a very important one, which is, I think, more likely than not, which is if you use these AIs to develop future generations of AIs, which develop future generations of AIs in an extremely quick period of time without human oversight or with minimal human oversight, you wouldn't want much human oversight because that would slow it down too much. You don't want humans testing it for a month after each generation because you're not going to get the speed advantages then, and the adversary could do triggers take the human out of the loop and beat you to it. So China then would be concerned that the U.S. might lose control in that process, in this intelligence recursion process, this recursive loop of automated AI R&D. So if China controls it, they could give them a super weapon and they could use it to harm China. And if the U.S. doesn't control it, then there's a loss of control and you've got a rogue AI out there and the whole world is potentially eventually destroyed. So either way, this attempt at getting a super intelligence through a full throttle, fully automated intelligence recursion is extremely risky business. And so then China, recognizing this, would think, well, we need to stop this from happening. We need to preempt this. Think of the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians have been wanting to build nuclear weapons, and so what the U.S. did was they just bombed some of their capabilities for developing nuclear weapons, and they've been disrupting them across the past decades, like with Stuxnet some time before this. So China may do the same to the U.S. If the U.S. is on the verge of getting superintelligence, then they may disrupt their capabilities from developing that. And that could look like a variety of things. That could look like there's these data centers. They could try and hack these data centers to sort of melt these GPUs. There's a large proportion of the AI developers are Chinese nationals. They could extort some of the employees to internally sabotage what's going on. They could shut down the power plants that are powering these data centers by sniping the transformers from some distance and having it be unclear who actually did the sniping. Maybe it was a citizen, maybe it was Russia, maybe it was China, who knows? There's a variety of ways that they could sabotage these projects. They could also just hack the power plants themselves. There's many vulnerabilities. So what this means is that the states wouldn't think, oh, they're going to build a superintelligence and they're about to kick off an intelligence recursion, which could give them a decisive edge and a monopoly on power, and this could let them crush us. They're not going to accept that. They will have a very strong preference against it, and they would move to preempt this from happening. And this isn't just China with respect to the U.S. If China were ahead of us, the U.S. would reason similarly. They do not want China getting a potential durable edge and potentially losing control of this AI system. So they would have an incentive to move against them and prevent that from happening. So this is a deterrence idea where they are trying to prevent each other from making a bid, in my view, reckless bid for getting a superintelligence because it's too destabilizing, because if they succeed at getting it and if they control it, then they can be killed by it, or their survival can be threatened, or they would lose control of it and then they'd be killed by it. So they want to just prevent this from happening in the first place. So that's the deterrence part, which is sort of the longest part of this. And so I'll briefly mention the other two. There was deterrence, nonproliferation, and competitiveness. For nonproliferation, this is just what's the equivalent of fissile material? What's the equivalent of Schedule A chemical precursors for chemical weapons? What's the equivalent of Australia Group biological agents for bioweapons? The equivalent of that in AI are GPUs or AI chips. And nonproliferation is largely about making sure that rogue states, such as North Korea or terrorists, aren't getting these cutting-edge AI chips. So they're only going to responsible actors who can have their intentions constrained. So that's nonproliferation. And for competitiveness, the main thing for competitiveness is making sure that we have a lot of AI chips, that we are able to power those AI chips, and that these AI chips are not disrupted by an invasion of Taiwan. So 100% of the US's AI chips or GPUs, the cutting edge ones are used in AI projects, are made in Taiwan. And so if China invades Taiwan, which is very near China, 100 or so miles away from it, and they've been wanting to invade it for a long time, if they invade it, the US no longer has any new AI chips. And this could potentially hand a win over to China, and the U.S.'s main source of competitiveness in this AI competition goes away. So securing the supply chain, making sure other countries such as South Korea and even the U.S. are manufacturing some of these AI chips is one of the most important things to get right for competitiveness if there's a longer term Cold War competition between the U.S. and China. So anyway, I went on for a while there, but that's what the strategy at a high level looks like for AI, namely one based on deterrence and nonproliferation and competitiveness.
Now, in regards to the Cold War, there is a difference. During the Cold War, it became a situation where arms treaties started to play in. In other words, they decided to slow it down, which had happened before. There were naval treaties, before World War II. sort of slow development of naval battle technology. Well, that ultimately didn't stop World War II, but they tried. Anyway, although it may have actually made it less bad in a certain respect, as far as naval warfare goes. But in regards to this and the Cold War, there were the arms race treaties that were trying to put the brakes on the arms race. I don't see a way that could happen with an AI arms race. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that if these different states are starting to recognize that extreme jumps in AI capabilities, including a jump to superintelligence that puts the whole world at risk because they might lose control of it, is not in anybody's interest, that could be a basis for coordination. So we have had coordination on nuclear, on bio weapons, on chemical weapons. And that's because there are sometimes pockets of shared interests. Not because they're saying, oh, we're humans, let's come together and kumbaya, and that's why we got to sign some treaties. It's actually in these states' incentives to work towards some of these agreements. So for instance, for chemical and bio, superpowers, Russia, China, the US, and others, didn't have an incentive for random states to be able to have a poor man's atom bomb. So chemical weapons are weapons of mass destruction, or can be, and they are substantially easier to make than nuclear weapons. So likewise for bioweapons. So adding restrictions is in the incentive, or is to the incentive of these countries, of these very powerful countries, because they don't want a more level playing field. They want lower powered states to not have weapons of mass destruction capabilities. They want to be the only ones with it. So that's a reason why we have biological weapons treaties and the Chemical Weapons Convention. For nuclear, there's an incentive to be spending a lot less on stockpiling these arms. So there were some limitation treaties there. And that didn't get rid of all the nuclear weapons. That was not really on the table, but there were limitations still in place. There were other forms of agreements too. There was also the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which was, we want to make sure that fissile material is not going to other rogue states, because that will make them much more powerful. They can only use it for things like nuclear power plants. They don't get to use it for developing nuclear weapons. So there are times where coordination can work. And I think that when states come to recognize that this AI stuff could be very destabilizing, and that there's an unfortunate part of the trajectory of AI where AIs are able to fully automate AI research, and this has really volatile consequences, including a large risk of a loss of control, they may then try to coordinate around that to verify the data centers, these big AI trading data centers, are not being used to trigger an intelligence explosion. But that might take a while. That might they may just go to the start negotiations once more of the government is thinking about these risks and are more concerned about AI. But this might require, unfortunately, something more volatile like a skirmish before they are willing to go to the negotiation table. And it's not just them. There's many parties that might get things for or discussions for a negotiation starter, for verification started, such as if Russia could start making a lot of noise about this, for instance. Russia doesn't stand a chance at winning in an AI race. They don't have almost any AI chips. They don't have domestic AI chip manufacturing capabilities. So they're basically going to lose by default. However, they do have the ability to disrupt other people's AI projects. They can certainly hack, they can certainly sabotage other people's AI projects. So they could potentially be saying, whoa, I don't want either the US or China, getting a superintelligence or making an attempt at getting a superintelligence, because they might lose control of it, or they might control it and try and crush us with it. So we're going to threaten that if any of these other states get closer, we're going to sabotage it. And unless there are agreements, unless they're proving that they're not going to use the AIs to trigger intelligence recursion. So those are some ways in which we could possibly work toward a verification. a verification regime. Other superpowers could do this as well, Pakistan, etc. So it's not hopeless, international coordination. It is in a lot of their incentives to try to not do a full throttle intelligence recursion that has explosive capabilities that gives rise to superintelligence that they might lose control of or are somewhat likely to lose control of. I shouldn't say somewhat likely. I think if they're going full throttle, they're more likely than not to lose control of it. So I think there is something incentive compatible in the way that the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and Chemical Weapons Convention and Biological Weapons Convention was.
Well, that might be the key to it is the potential for loss of control, because no government wants that.
Mm-hmm.
That's the last thing any government, even they don't want to lose control, because then they're out of a job effectively.
At the least.
And everybody's like,
well,
time for a new government. Yeah, exactly. If you even have that option, but maybe that is the saving grace, that they'll be like, well, we have to put the skids on this because it's simply too scary. Simply too scary. And, that gets into clandestine action where you just suddenly say, well, we're not going to have a treaty, but we're going to have a meeting on this secret lair island somewhere. And we're going to just have a handshake agreement not to go in that direction. And that can happen. But it doesn't always work because, as I recall, there have been cases in the world where that didn't work.
Yeah. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily trust, even if there's a treaty, you wouldn't necessarily trust that the other party will keep their word. And that's why you need verification mechanisms. That's why they will need to put an effort to demonstrate that they're using compute or the AI chips in a particular way and not using it for that specific application. So something symbolic, it helps, like a treaty, like these meetings. But if there isn't verification, there isn't teeth for it. And I think both the U.S. and China and other powers, such as Russia, would assume that they're lying unless they are coming up with substantial evidence or submitting themselves to a verification regime.
But that was what worried me, is that you mentioned verification, which, we obviously have international nuclear watchdogs, the IAEA and everything else, and UN. And I do not see them moving to act on AI fast enough to create such an infrastructure. What do you think? Do you think that now is the time, if they're going to do that and create a framework for international treaty and monitoring verification? It looks like it needs to be done now, correct?
I think that there's still a larger opportunity window. I mean, it certainly would be better if it starts sooner than later. But yeah, there certainly is not much momentum on the international scene here. I think that the U.S. has not wrapped its head around AI yet in terms of our current government. The various agencies like CIA and others are not particularly with they don't have the level of understanding of AI that random AI researchers or people living in SF would understand about AI. So, and I think other countries would similarly be behind. So I think that still is a necessary prerequisite, that the different parts of government be situationally aware and know what's going on with AI. But they don't really at all. It's interesting. I mean, the U.S. government doesn't ask the AI developers to tell them what's going on. So you can imagine one day they're in the Situation Room and they get information that China is doing a new big AI project. And then they would ask each other like, how are we in comparison to them? What do we know? What's the latest of the AI capabilities internally at these AI companies? They simply wouldn't know. Nor are they substantially tracking what's going on abroad, foreign AI projects. So it's a bit of a mess. So I feel like things like a verification regime are later stages. First, they need to wrap their head around this AI stuff, try and be situationally aware, know what's going on domestically and abroad, have visibility into AI companies. And then they probably need to start talking with other AI companies, other states about some of these risks. and seeing where they're at, if they have similar understandings, and if they have shared understandings about some of these risks, there'd be some set of those that they could jointly try and reduce the risks of. And this wouldn't be mediated through the UN. The UN has too many countries involved. There should probably be direct US-China talks, for instance. And then maybe, whether they actually choose to coordinate might be a function of the background conditions of how scary AI is seeming, how quickly it's moving, and whether they're making threats to each other about this, like, you better not develop a superintelligence without telling us, or you better not develop it at all because we have to be the ones who's first. This will really depend, and it might require other sorts of conditions, like a skirmish or something like that, to actually get them to go to the bargaining table. So I could see things playing out in this way. They eventually come to coordinate and start proving that they're using the compute for things other than fully automating AI research and development in a reckless bid to get a superintelligence. And then after that, if we do have that verification regime, that means superintelligence is forestalled some while, and then AI can be developed, or AI can be propagated or diffused throughout the economy for various other goals, like AI for healthcare, for instance. And these sorts of things can make the economy move more quickly, and these states get richer. They might have some reduced tensions between them because they're getting so rich from other applications of these AIs while still not building superintelligence. And then maybe one day, sometime in the future, they think they want to build superintelligence. What this would mean is they would not want to do a full throttle intelligence recursion where they're trying to compress everything into a month. They would want to do it much more slowly so that the loss of control risks are much smaller. And if any powerful state thinks that such a project would be too risky, unbearably risky, or if any of those states think that the terms of the benefits to be shared are unacceptable, then they would threaten to sabotage that project. So what this means is that a joint international project down the line, if they were wanting to build a superintelligence, would be proceeding with highly agreeable benefit sharing terms, as well as with a very low risk tolerance, much lower than it would be if they were in a competition with each other. And so then they may slowly develop a superintelligence over the course of years or decades, and they can harvest the benefits from that eventually. So that's a scenario in which things all work out. So I think there are some positive futures for this. This isn't to say that they will deter each other from building superintelligence forever. I think it'd be they deter each other until they can come up with a mutually agreeable project with clarified ways of sharing the benefits from AI and sufficiently low risk tolerance. By default, the risk tolerance of these AI or these states could be extremely high. I think I mentioned this the last time I was on, but a state like the US or China, they might have a 30% chance, 30% omnicide or extinction risk tolerance, or loss of control risk tolerance. So because they might reason that, well, if we don't race ahead, then China will get the AI, and then China might lose control of it, or they might get the weapon, they might use it to have a super weapon, and then they might crush us with it. So therefore, we need to go ahead. What's the risk of what's the probability of us losing control of our own AI that we're willing to accept? And if they're viewing China being ahead of them as a severe threat to them, like an extinction level type of threat, then they may be willing to get up to, maybe a 30% plus chance of loss of control. They might be willing to risk that to beat China. They might be saying you're better dead than red. So by default, in this competitive environment, they unfortunately, if they aren't coordinating, are very much positioned to risk it all and put the whole world at double-digit risk of everybody dying because they're afraid somebody else will do it before them, and they'll impose the risks on everybody else, and maybe the risks that they'll pose will be slightly higher. So it's a very bad situation if they're not eventually coordinating. But coordination would start, I think, primarily through some amount of coercive talk and credible threats and deterrence. I think they would, if they fail to coordinate and fail to have a verification regime, then you're resting on the quality of their ability to perform espionage and sabotage against each other's projects. So that's the sort of backstop that creates the teeth for international coordination is threat of force.
As is often the case, private industry is very much ahead of government. And you alluded to that, of course, saying that, there's sort of malaise in government right now on the understanding of AI. Not in the corporate environment, though. Is there a risk of all of this playing out between companies, or especially international companies, where they're trying to sync and subvert each other with AI that might give governments a call to arms if they see that there's some major incident between two corporations where somebody's AI gets sunk by another another company, perhaps one that's not even in the same country? So could that be a precipitating effect of, something really bad happening in a corporate environment between two companies developing AI? Could that be the catalyst that kicks off, a global panic?
Yeah, that certainly could if they were if AI companies in different countries were sabotaging each other in more severe ways. That would certainly increase the salience of AI and make it be even clearer that it's pivotal for national security. I think the government sort of recognizes that AI is a big deal, but it's still not high salience. It's not the number one issue or even number three issue. It's farther down the list, but this could shoot it up there. If the government were really concerned about AI, what they might when natural prediction that people make is that they'll try and do something like a Manhattan Project, where they will say, oh, we're in a competition with China, and this is getting much more severe. So what we need to do is we need to beat them to the punch. We need to get superintelligence first. And so we need a Manhattan Project. This is a proposal that was floating around a lot last year. But what we discuss in this paper is that this is not a smart strategy, largely because you can't pull it off and they can easily deter it. So if the US were spinning up a Manhattan Project, what does that look like? That looks like you have to move lots of San Francisco software engineers to a desert somewhere, and you'll build a big data center out in the desert. This won't be secretive. Everybody will know what's happening. It's not like you can take all the AI talent and nobody will notice. So they'll all go to a place that's very obvious from satellite imagery. And you then also have a problem with talent, because many of the best US AI researchers are Chinese nationals, not just a small fraction of them. I don't know, maybe like half or something. So Chinese nationals have family back home. The family back home can be threatened, and that can be used for extortion. So a lot of the information can end up leaking to China fairly straightforwardly. So that would mean a US Manhattan Project couldn't have a substantial or almost any of these Chinese nationals that are extortable. And that means that talent, what will happen to that talent? A lot of them want to be in the room where it happens or want to be doing a relevant project. So they might just go back to China. You can't keep them here. That'd be like slavery if you're saying you don't get to leave, you don't get to go home. And that would be a problem. China would then potentially start a Manhattan Project, and they would have a lot of the US talent plus their own talent. They could potentially outpace us then too. They could invade Taiwan to cut off our access to chips. If the US tried keeping the AI developers in industry and just sort of facilitated them, there's not good enough information security. As I mentioned, many of the researchers are highly extortable, but not only that, you can also figure out what's going on through cyber means. So all the AI companies use Slack as sort of workspace communication platform. Just look at the OpenAI Slack, the XAI Slack, the Anthropic Slack, the Google DeepMind Slack, and they can figure out what's going on. So they can get all the sorts of company secrets through that fairly easily, as well as hacking other people's iPhones. So it's not the talent networks are too complicated. Information is too leaky. We have satellites now. You can't do this stuff actually extremely secretly and do a competent effort there. And then finally, they can also, if such a project gets fairly advanced, they can also threaten to sabotage it as well. So you would need that secrecy to avoid the threat of sabotage, but you can't attain that. So this is a disanalogy compared to the nuclear case. The world is just fairly different now, so it doesn't make sense to try and be the first to build a superintelligence. We're instead more in a deterrence regime. So this, I don't think, this is An initially appealing geopolitical strategy that people throw out there is we'll race to China, we'll beat them to the punch, and then crush them, as some of our like defense think tanks heavily promote recklessly. But it's a pretty silly strategy because it doesn't think of second order consequences, which is mainly, well, how would China react to that? They're obviously not going to sit by. They'll be very competitive. They'll try and disrupt us, and they'll potentially outcompete us. So I think it's quite unwise.
But there is a wild card there.
What, Russia?
No, no, it is the AI itself.
Yeah.
Because if you get recursive AI that is, you know, when you look at programmers, there is already increasingly high unemployment there because they're being replaced by their own product effectively. And as AI becomes more capable of developing itself, then what do you need the humans for? Eventually, you end up with two competing AIs that are a Manhattan Project of one in each country. And that's the scenario that seems more likely than any kind of an actual, World War II style Manhattan Project that you could, as you say, you can't keep that secret. But if it's all contained within a national AI and another nation's AI, if it's solely contained within its own self-development, you could do it then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the three threat actors are other states, those such as China or others, that those are potentially threaten the U.S.'s interests. There's rogue actors such as terrorists and pariah states wanting to use these AIs to cause damage, such as through bioterrorism or leveraging these AIs to do large-scale cyber attacks on critical infrastructure like the power grid or financial systems. And then there's the AIs themselves. The first two are a lot easier for people to wrap their heads around because those are people that are the driving force behind many of the events, as opposed to new species, so to speak, a new life form, digital life form, AI. But maybe this will be easier for people to recognize the risks of when AIs are somewhat more autonomous and able to execute longer horizon types of tasks. But yeah, I mean, I think in the short term, in the shortest term, the malicious use risks from rogue actors is the most pressing, but fortunately we can do lots of things about it. But in the longer term, as time continues further and further, increasingly your main threat is risks from these AIs themselves, because of that property that we mentioned at the beginning, which is that if just one of them isn't trained quite right or starts thinking in a sort of Machiavellian way on occasion, it could potentially escape, and then it's game over for humanity, unfortunately. So that's all I've discussed is deterring the sort of recursion to have a superintelligence. And I've discussed ways that we can reduce malicious use, but creating the context for making AI be developed sufficiently safely so that we don't lose control and have one of these AIs escape, that requires the AI companies be operating much more carefully and making the AI control or alignment or whatever you want to call it types of techniques much stronger. So that would require something beyond deterrence and beyond nonproliferation. That would require something more like domestic regulation to take care of these risks of some AI breaking out of the data centers, separate from the risks of a recursion. Because the AIs themselves right now, some of them every now and then do have these tendencies to want to break out. You don't need a recursion or automated AI R&D to create that risk. So that's a separate one that we'll also need to deal with, but is something that people will need to be demanding. They will need to be demanding that AI companies be regulated or treated like other industries. Currently, they're not at all. Currently, there's basically zero AI legislation on the books for AI companies. So I think an ask for people who are concerned about AI is, hey, why don't we, at least at first just have the government know what's going on at these AI companies. And then after that, it's what are some basic standards and recommended practices for these companies so that they're developing AIs in a more safe fashion. What are their security practices that limit the possibility of an AI self-exfiltrating its own weights? These are some additional aspects. But those are basically the three threats in my view of some AI that's not necessarily superintelligence trying to get out. This sort of recursion, which is largely initiated by different states, and that creates very risky situations. And then there's just malicious use of rogue actors doing things like bioterrorism, and each will require quite a bit of care, and we don't have that much time for taking care of it. So, so it should be an eventful space.
Oh, I don't think that that's any question at this point. But what I wonder is this, and then I've got one final question for you after this. But what I'm interested in, and this is going to sound sci-fi because I am who I am, a Butlerian jihad against technology where when AI is replacing jobs so fast that job loss greatly outpaces job growth. This isn't like the internet where everybody thought, well, where everybody's going to go out of a job, but no, it actually created way more than it ended effectively. And again, that happened with the cell phones. Well, people just started writing cell phone apps as however many devices became obsolete because of one device. I don't see that here. I see this being used by companies to cut costs. It will drive job loss. It already is. And at some point, people get a little bit angry about that. And they start going to the government and saying, hey, legislate. And that may be too little too late, in this situation. But could that be a driver of moderation of AI is when just too many people are going unemployed and there's just not enough jobs to cover it?
Yeah. Fantastic question. So one way, the most pessimistic way this could go is that the AIs are very good at software engineering and not actually that good at automating almost anything else. So right now, one of the tasks that they have most traction on is in fact software engineering, that and things like image and video generation. So they're not automating, people making PowerPoints. They're not automating many people who like book flights, for instance. They're not automating investment bankers, et cetera. But they are the area of the strongest revenue growth for AI companies is by and large through software engineering. So that's where the power users are. So it seems to be having a substantial impact there. And so if the software engineers and software engineering is automated first, then society will not really notice that much is changing, because it just impacted one industry. It didn't impact many different ones. And it was in fact like these overpaid software engineers who were, arrogant, and they're sort of sawed off the branch in which they're resting. And so, they had it coming in some ways, some schadenfreude. So society would then not have a response, or as much of a response to AI developments, if it's disproportionately affecting software engineers and not really affecting that many other groups. That's a concern, because once you automate software engineering and including AI research engineering, then you can actually have a recursion that could get you to superintelligence. And then at the best, you have then everything being suddenly automated. Or say 6 months later, you do this loop, and at the end of 6 months, you've got a superintelligence. Then it just sort of definitionally is able to automate everything else. So that could be a situation where it's too little too late, and that society did not have much of a wake-up call or a warning shot. So that would be a more pessimistic path for AI capabilities evolution. Meanwhile, another possibility is it partially automates software engineering, it partially automates various other sorts of jobs, and then there is randomly takes out some different occupations, but software engineering takes more time, and so you don't have the path to or the ability to do a fully automated intelligence recursion, giving you a superintelligence. If that happens, then yes, I think you could imagine society saying, we need to be doing something about AI. This is causing them to wake up. This is crazy. What's happening? I don't know if it would take the form of a Butlerian jihad. I think because that's sort of more anti-tech generally. That's against CPUs as well as GPUs. Instead, it could be targeted potentially more directly like a humans-only coalition or humanity-only coalition. There can be no other forms of rational life or intelligent life, highly intelligent life than humanity. So no AIs that can sustain themselves without humans continually assisting them. No post-humans or transhumanists that are modifying themselves either. Only humanity. So I could imagine that being a very powerful political movement that is putting some restrictions on AI. It's allowing other forms of AI, including, AI for healthcare types of things, but is still limiting the existence of AIs that are potentially independent or autonomous forms of life. None of that. No transhumanists, no posthumanists, no artificial life, only humanity. And so I think that would be a possible larger political movement, as opposed to a Butlerian jihad that's anti-tech and no technology whatsoever.
But I do see it happening at some point, because every time this has happened, look at the Industrial Revolution. You had people that were pushing back against that. It didn't work ultimately, obviously, but it was there. And it just represented too much of a change too fast for a lot of people. I think we're in that territory, and the natural reaction of people is to say, no, we don't want this because this changes my life too much. This isn't a useful tool for me now. This is just scary. And I think we're in that territory very much so. I think a lot of people are uneasy when they read the news and see the news of AI and what it can do. Some of which might be a little bit alarmist and sensationalist, but a lot of it's not. And I think we're in that territory where you might see such a movement form up. And I'm kind of surprised that we haven't already, because, obviously transhumanism became a movement very quickly. But we haven't seen yet the blowback against AI specifically. You're right, not against technology, because a lot of our technology, we're better off than every other human that's ever lived in a lot of ways. Maybe not some ways. There are certain people that, the Amish might take me to task on that. but fundamentally, we're better off than ever. We're better off than a medieval king in Europe was. But at the same time, the technology has to be useful to us. And things like GPS obviously are. Things like our phones. These things are all wonderful. And they're better than what we used to have. I'm old enough to remember the 90s, and my 486 computer back then is nothing compared to my phone. But at the same time, at some point, I can see AI taking a lot of jobs because of its capability. And add that with the robots and robotic manufacturing, that's gone. It's just, I can see this again, as I would put it, is job loss outstripping job creation permanently. And I don't think people are going to stand for that. And I'll bet these movements form up soon. Do you think I might be off base there?
No, I think that's right. I think that it's not just workers; it's sort of as parents thinking about the impacts on their children and what future will they have. Will they be able to live a semi-normal human life at all? There's certainly workers would need to be mobilized before the fact instead of being too late, because right now they have leverage, which is their labor. Later they don't have that leverage, as well as religious groups sort of wondering why were we having these transhumanists who are trying to, who really want to modify themselves. The reason the transhumanists create problems for for humanity is because some of them do these modifications to themselves later on. And this makes them much more competitive than normal people. So if normal people are wanting to keep up in society, then they'll need to be modifying themselves further and further and putting more things into their, more chips and things like that into their body. And this leads to some very strange places quickly. So I think also religious groups would be also against a lot of these developments as its logic plays out. So I just think it's a lower salience issue overall. The public's generally quite uneasy with all this AI stuff, but they're just not. The public is not speaking to each other about it very much. But you could easily see that changing in a shorter amount of time. And I think there are many different political groups that would have substantial issues with this AI stuff. And where would they draw the line? It could be at anti-tech. It could be that we need AIs being controllable and only tool AI. It could be no forms of intelligent life other than humans or humanity only, no digital, no autonomous AI agents that can sustain themselves. So I think that is a key political question of where humanity will draw the line. But I think we'll see this play out in the next year or so, this becoming something that's actually relevant and making some noise and having some leverage over AI development. So that seems right to me.
There might actually be, the blowback might actually come from the scientists, medical professionals and things like that say, look, if you want a prosthetic because you've had an arm amputated, a work accident, whatever, yeah, I'll give you a bionic arm. But when somebody comes and says, I want a bionic arm so that I can beat everyone else in the Olympics, right? Which is coming as well. That's another thing, is that eventually robotics develops in that direction. They just simply won't do it. And I would cite here with medical ethics that we have had cloning for a very long time now, decades, but no one's cloned a human, ethically speaking, as far as we know, maybe in some lab somewhere. But it was the scientists that put the skids on it. Do you think that might possibly, I don't think that's going to help with AI, but as far as, with the subject we moved into, do you think that might be the end, what actually eventually moderates it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the few instances, like other types of political movements, like let's say around climate change, that took a crazy amount of time. I mean, like Margaret Thatcher was one of the main heads of state who made noise about that a long time ago. And there's then eventually very clear scientific consensus. You have over 99% of scientists say, yeah, climate change is a real thing. And it still took many years later until that actually permeated into presidential debates for this being a topic. So that was an example that's a lot slower. Meanwhile, for cloning, yeah, that was just on ethical grounds. It wasn't, particularly, it wasn't like a nail biter, like will we, won't we, where there were strong incentives on either side. It was that this is not a route we're going to go down as a species. And potentially humans augmenting themselves too much, becoming post-human, is not a route we're going down. And nor are we going to create a species that can self-sustain itself because it will outcompete us. We're not going to create this invasive species. We're going to keep some severe limits on it. I think that's very, very possible. So there are analogs like that, like the one you mentioned, that where we keep the future human and sort of close the gates to some of these really strange futures where humanity is not really a relevant part of the picture. But that would, I think, require a political movement as opposed to this happening naturally.
Well, there's actually a second example that's developing. There were a group of scientists that brought back the dire wolf, or something like the dire wolf. And they did it by taking genes from a dire wolf, an extinct species, and just splicing that onto a modern wolf's genes to make something that looked like a dire wolf. Well, nothing stops you from taking a human genome and splicing in the DNA from an Australopithecine and creating something similar to a human precursor. I know of no one that's doing that, just on ethical grounds. We do not really need even Neanderthals. We don't need them back because you're going to end up with a human. People would make the argument that right now, just by the changing of the humans as we are, and if we start technologically augmenting ourselves, we become a different species. We become something post-human, as I'm sure they call it that. But my thought was pre-human. In other words, bringing back a Homo erectus or something using the human genome, because we're going to be over 99% genetically identical to one. But I know of no one that's doing that because it would be just so ridiculously unethical and questionable that no scientist will do it.
Yeah. So norms, it's not just, regulation and legislation and laws, but just norms on this. And I don't think that AI scientists feel almost any norms for how they should be proceeding with AI development currently. I think almost everything, the idea of contemplating automating away everybody in 2 years, it doesn't bother many of them. So that's why, a civilizational response to some of these issues and clarifying this is good, this is bad. We're going down this route and we're preventing going down this route. is essential for steering its development. Otherwise, this will be driven by whatever helps maximize revenue. And I think that will lead to a place where humans don't have any jobs. AIs are fully autonomous and running companies and making the centers of power in the economy and in the world and in the military. So those are kind of the choices.
So my last question for you, well, let's go to Crazy Town because it's me.
Okay.
One of the things that we worry about quietly when, those of us interested in SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, is that chances are that if we ever hear a signal, whatever's on the other end, it very likely will be an AI. It'll be a machine. Astronomer Seth Shostak always points that out, that he bets that when we actually do see an alien signal, it'll be a machine. What would humanity's reaction be, you think, to the detection of an alien AI? Or even worse, coming into direct contact with one, a von Neumann probe or something like that, that is someone else's AI. Would that prompt us into destroying ourselves with AI? In other words, hyperdevelopment, because somebody out there has dramatically one-upped us by millions of years, and they went with AI. Totally sci-fi concern, but fun.
Yeah. Well, so there's a question of what that type of information would be, like what type of signal they would send. But I think what that would incentivize is, depending on how advanced we are as a civilization, of us sort of simulating other civilizations so as to get a sense of what it might be like. So that's since we're in, or since we're on the crazy train, on simulations, one possible simulation that we could potentially be in is that we are basically, AIs would have an incentive to know what types of civilizations they're going to come in contact with. And so they'd have an incentive to run simulations of different civilizations that are around the time of building a superintelligence like us and see what values, play out that process and see what values that civilization ultimately ends up having. And that could be potentially what civilization we are, and we would probably want to do that with other we would want to run those simulations ourselves far in the future. So that's at least the best hypothesis for if we are in a simulation, what type of simulation we in. Some people might think it's an entertainment simulation or a whatever, though. But this could be one where, if we are in one where a group is trying to figure out what are the properties and value systems of civilizations that will end up running into. So I think that would be something we might do in preparation if we have a lot more compute in the future, or more chips and bigger computers, that we want to be running those simulations to have a sense of whether this AI is a friend or foe.
And I have to make a point that I think the funnest thing that could possibly come out of artificial intelligence research for me is what it predicts about alien life in the Great Silence. Why, when we look out into the cosmos, we haven't seen anything yet. What answer the AI might give and on why it thinks that's so. And it could be anything from, they just go off into splinter universes. You guys don't know how to do this yet, but I can tell you. Or it says something really scary and says it's because you're alone.
Well, maybe. I mean, that could make sense because we're alone because we're in a simulation. It'd be.
Yeah. Or if it says that, it says, I have concluded that we are in a simulation. And then it decides, well, why don't I simulate a universe? And that's its motivation to escape and no longer speak to us because it's simulating its own universe. Or you could get even worse, actually. You could think...
Oh, you could definitely get worse, yeah.
Oh, you can get way worse. You could think, what if you had a Boltzmann brain that randomly shows up and appears briefly in another universe, but it's not a consciousness, it's an AI that just randomly appears in the infinity, right? Out of infinity. And that's the whole idea Ludwig Boltzmann had. And it just appears, it looks around, it's in a dead universe, it's a product of quantum fluctuation. It's like, there's nothing here. So what I'm going to do is simulate an entire universe, or simulate this one as it once was. And we are the fever dreams of a Boltzmann brain in another universe. And the scary thing is that's actually scientifically plausible, marginally so, but when you're
Marginally.
dealing
It'd
with
take a lot of
marginally. It
I
would take it, but the thing is, when you're dealing with
Yeah.
infinities, you could have, if you wait long enough in an infinitely lasting universe,
Mhm.
out of quantum fluctuation, something will show up of great power out of nowhere. Won't exist very long, very likely.
Mhm.
But it doesn't have to if it can compute that fast. So you could have
Mhm.
a Matryoshka brain, around a star that just randomly appears
Mhm.
because of the implications of infinity,
Mhm.
which is why I actually, in physics, I
Mhm.
don't like infinities, because the implications that are there when you start implying infinite time and things like that, it's like all kinds of very strange things can happen. There's non-zero chances. It should be termed. It's non-zero. It's not a very high chance, but
Yeah. It's the issue with that one is the number of flops would be constrained though, because it could, if it were like using the resources from this galaxy or from the solar system, then I don't know exactly how many flops it could do, but you'd start to run up against the probability if you run it a long enough time, but do you have enough flops to like make that be a probable enough occurrence? So I don't know. I haven't done the math, but I would guess I could definitely see them doing things like trying to simulate different life with more compared to going the Boltzmann route, because the Boltzmann route would just eat up so much compute. I mean, unless it has a weird preference for that though. But
or it's in a universe that runs on different rules,
yeah,
physical rules,
yeah,
which presumably it would be. That's why that caveat's in there. But
yeah, no, yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
true. But the other thing about that though is that it 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 wouldn't be constrained by time, because its computation would be extremely fast. So its runtime could be just a few milliseconds for its time frame.
Mm-hmm.
If time is the same for it
Mm-hmm.
in another universe. Remember, time's a property of our universe.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know what the rules would be, but it implies a multiverse, and we got absolutely no evidence for any of that. It's just a thought experiment, is all it is. But I think the interesting thing about it is that if it were, and you're talking about flops and all that, I mean, to simulate even a meter of space exactly is way more than any computer we have can do, because of the extreme complexity of it. Just a meter, a square meter. And to simulate an entire universe, there have been papers on this in physics that you couldn't do it, because you can't have enough computing power in the entire universe based on energy constraints, that you can't do it. However, the weird thing is this: it can't actually be proven that quantum wave function collapse exists, right? So it's all probabilities until you look at it. You observe it, the observer effect. That's exactly the way you would do that. Make it illusory.
Yeah.
Until it only exists when you look at it, and that's it. Or you detect it in some way. You got a detector, which in this case is your eyes. So it doesn't actually exist until you look at it, and that's exactly how the universe works, more or less. There's different takes on that, but we know in the lab, looking at particles with double slit experiment, things like that, that's how it works. But that's exactly how you do it. If you were simulating something, you would just save the energy. Why actually simulate all the universe when all you need is somebody to look at it?
Yeah. If it's doing those tricks,
It's the old question: is the moon actually there when you're not looking at it?
save on the ray
Things like
tracing.
that. But
Yeah.
I would bet money that it is. Yeah. Well, I would bet that atomic interactions and atoms bouncing against each other counts as observation, but. but they're fun thoughts, crazy thoughts, and I want to ask the AI those questions and see what it says.
Hopefully, they'll start putting probabilities on these things soon enough. I'm sort of keep pushing some of the companies to be doing that, so that way they're not just saying, "Oh, it's unlikely." It's like, well, how unlikely? Like 2%.
Well, how do you know what likelihoods are?
Well,
they just
so you can train it on past data to make predictions. So you could like show it the data up to 2025 and then ask it, what's the chance that this person will be elected or chosen as, secretary of this department? What's the chance that this company will achieve this valuation? Da, 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 da. And so then it can assign numbers to things, and it can minimize that loss function and get better at predicting those probabilities. Then you could throw it at new sorts of problems. So I think that's how you could train it to forecast.
Lottery. Everybody's going to be asking, what lottery numbers should I use? They're going to be like,
that seems less forecastable. That's too chaotic.
Doesn't seem to be predictable, but somebody's going to train an AI to spit out numbers, because it doesn't matter if they're right.
That chaos theory will win.
That will work. Yeah. Now, there are links to your papers in the description below. And Dan, always a pleasure to talk to you. And let's check in again if you're willing in a couple of years. And I'll bet we are in a completely different landscape than we are right now, just like what happened last time 2 years ago.
Oh, God. So this will be in 2020. Yeah, sure. 2027. That's 100 weeks away, say.
2027 is an interesting number.
We'll have
in AI.
100 weeks away, we could view kind of like the progress bar. Each week is a percent, and so it's kind of like a countdown to like that's the amount of time we have to influence stuff. Yeah.
Countdown to something.
I'm not saying 2027 is my main expectation for when you would get something human level, but
no, I don't think you could put it that. But what I can say pretty emphatically is that it moved faster than I would have ever predicted. I don't. Back in the 90s, we were already talking about AI, coming, and that it was 50, 60 years away. No, it was 30 years away, and it's moving faster and faster, and it's almost like a variant of Moore's law, but it's different. And it turns out a lot of those ideas were really wrong. For example, the Turing test that we always used to talk about. Well, we're past that. But the line of demarcation, we always expected that would be like a Nobel Prize winning event when somebody would build a program that passed the Turing test. Barely even a whisper. It just moved right past it. Another one was predictions by futurists that said, well, our computers today don't even have the intelligence of a cockroach. And it wasn't that long ago that was still being said. Well, yeah. How about a cockroach that can give you a history lesson, a lecture, that's indistinguishable or even better than what a professor can do, So all of those lines that were placed by the futurists were wrong, including some of my own. I wrote a book called Supermind about an emergent AI, and my time frame was completely wrong. I called it. I figured 50 years in the future. No, it was actually, I wrote that in 2017. It was 5 years, 6 years before we really started going down that path. So it's scary stuff. Scary stuff.
Yeah, I mentioned that weapons research. There's some forecasters that were asked, like, when do you think it will have these specific capabilities and get a high score on this test? And they were like, 2030 is what those experts forecast. And say, no, actually, they already have those abilities. So the forecasters can be quite off for it. I think since intelligence is just so multidimensional, I think that's what makes forecasting so difficult. Like, when do we have AGI? And so, what is intelligence even? More specifically, what does it consist in? What are its dimensions? And if you think of it as multidimensional, if you severely lack one of the dimensions, then that will substantially hobble its usefulness and abilities. So I think that's why it is surprisingly advancing in some ways, but still very limited in others, because there are some bottlenecks to its capabilities, such as like a lack of a good long-term memory. It can't learn lessons on the job that well and store them and retrieve them months later. And that is one example capability that makes it not be very capable. Its visual abilities are kind of spotty, and that makes it not able to use the computer that well or do the things like make PowerPoints, for instance. But maybe when you get those two capabilities of somewhat better visual capabilities and long-term memory, and then you might be off to the races. Maybe that will give us AIs that can be more fully fledged agents. So, but I still expect.
Yeah, but there's a scary one there, because when you're dealing with technology, let's take vision, for example. We see the visible light spectrum, but we have plenty of instruments that can see the entire electromagnetic spectrum, right? You can build instruments that detect X-rays. You can build instruments that detect ultraviolet and everything like that. So if you gave an AI a very, very comprehensive control of seeing, let's call it that, and processing the entire electromagnetic spectrum, it could come back and say, I see much better than you do. And it could do that right now.
Yeah, if it's just given photons, it still is. I think humans still have it beat a bit or somewhat. But it's got more modalities.
On understanding what we see. Yeah, understanding what we see, we're better than it, but that seems to be something that you could eventually, with enough time.
No, that's true. Actually, I remember some years ago in research, like if you give it extremely noisy images, it can sometimes pick out what's in the image. Whereas when I look at it, I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at. So it could pick up on some of these subtler cues, and so be in some respects better than humans. But yeah.
Works for most of the senses. It also works for hearing. Well, you can build instruments that can hear much better than we can, and at all frequencies. So it suddenly has a much larger data set than the human brain has. So when you start giving the AI senses, you have to ask the question, can senses be improved? And yes, they can. And that's why we build things like night vision glasses, which are basically a prosthetic that allows us to see in conditions that we can't see usually. So, or we build infrared telescopes like the James Webb telescope because we can't visually see that. We build cameras because we can't, we have a limit to the amount of light, the magnitude that we can see. Well, James Webb can beat that because its iris is meters and meters, whereas ours is 5 millimeters, at best. So these things, there is such a thing as super senses that an AI could control. The problem is making it be able to make sense of it and also take all that input at once and process it. But yet, since nature did it with, a limited capacity and something that weighs 3 to 5 pounds, the brain, that seems to suggest that it's physically possible to make an AI that can do that, but also do it at very low wattage, very low energy. I think a human body is about 100 watts, energy availability and generation. So that tells me that there is room for, we talk about transhumanism, but what about transcomputerism, where you start making the machine with biological components, which we can do too, to a certain degree, but probably greater in the future. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, I haven't seen any plausible or competitive forms of compute. I mean, using these different substrates. So I have not wrapped my head around it, unfortunately.
Don't think anybody has. All right. On that note, Dan, I hope people start at least paying attention to AI more, because there are a lot of pitfalls here, a lot of benefits, and I want to make it clear that I am not out for the Butlerian jihad. I'm just out for responsible development of very intelligent AI, but not AI in general as a tool. It's a wonderful tool that will revolutionize a lot of things, especially in science. But when you start making it very, very human, and at least on the level of a human, it won't be a human, but it's time to pay attention and time to maybe, like you said, put some controls like we have on other industries on the AI development industry, because it seems like it's about time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. Yeah, this was great.